Okay, on today's forum. Today's forum is What's on Your Mind, featuring Mr. Hugh Dorrian, Columbus's elected city auditor for the past 45, 46 years now, Mr. Dorrian. This series is sponsored by the Columbus Monthly Magazine and Taft Law. Won't you please help me thank them, and their associates are here, and welcome Janika Tucker, partner at Taft Law, to the podium to introduce the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Emmett. Good afternoon, everyone. Taft Law is proud to support the mission of the Columbus Metropolitan Club to engage the community in the conversations that recognize the importance of outstanding leaders in our region. Those who have championed our city and worked hard to make it a great place to live, to learn, to welcome others, and to be entertained and to do business. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce a pillar in our community and one of the longest-serving public servants in the nation, a dedicated and hardworking trustee who has always put fiscal responsibility and the public interest first and foremost, now serving in his 46th year as our auditor. Please welcome Hugh Dorrian. And before I turn the podium over to Mr. Dorrian, I'd like to also recognize and introduce a rising star in Ohio journalism. He is a fixture at the Statehouse, so please welcome Statehouse News Bureau, Andy Chow, who will have the opportunity to, interview Mr. Dorrian today. Let's welcome him. Mr. Dorrian, now the podium is all yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Danica. I mentioned earlier that I'm so surprised that the Columbus Metropolitan Club ran out of speakers. But I'm very happy to be here, and I thank them for the opportunity to share a few thoughts. You know, anecdotally, I want to start by making a comment. I think most of you, and certainly everyone in the investment world, has heard a great deal about Columbus and our AAA bond ratings, the best credit rating you can possibly get. But what a lot of us lose sight of is that those AAA bond ratings started in 1995 under the administration of Mayor Greg Lashutka, right down here. As you can imagine, after this number of years, I fancy myself as a student of government, and in particular, local government. And if I could share with you a thought that I've had for some time, but I think has to be addressed in future years, and I think the sooner the better. But when you look at the rising costs of government, all of us don't like to see these rising costs, but they will continue. There are a number of different reasons why. But I think maybe one reason is that we have too many governments. We have too many. If we look across this United States of ours, we have about 90,000 local governments. Now, we might think, well, that's the United States of America, nothing we can do about that. Let's get a little closer to home. A little closer to home, the state of Ohio. We have almost 4,000 governments in the state of Ohio. That number boggles the mind. I think sometimes of my good friend Dave Yost and the number of audits he has to conduct when he thinks of the public entities and the quasi-public entities. He's got close to 6,000 auditees, as we say. Big, big task. Well, let's get a little closer to home. How about Franklin County? Let me mention first about the state of Ohio again. Over 600 school districts. Over 1,300 townships, over 900 cities and villages, many, many, many numbers. Look at Franklin County. Think of what we have here. How many of you would believe that we have 36 different police departments in Franklin County? We have 23 fire divisions in Franklin County. I think we have about 17 townships that overlay in Franklin County, in whole or in part. I think we have something like 24 school districts that lie wholly or in part in Franklin County. I have to think to myself that there has to be an evolution of gaining some efficiencies. I've given up on the idea of a unigov in the truest sense, but I have not given up on the idea of unifying the delivery of some services. I think the best example of a good delivery of service is the City of Columbus's water and sewer divisions. Columbus has, depending upon which statistics you like to read, about 130,000, 830,000 or so. But that water and sewer system is regional. It serves about 1,000,001 or 1,200,000 people. One of the, I think, very, very successful mergers, taking services of commonality and bringing them together, is our Columbus Regional Airport Authority. It wasn't too many years ago when Columbus, and Greg will remember this, we had two airports. They were divisions of the city, owned and operated by the city, Port Columbus and Bolton Field. Franklin County, previously Lockbourne Air Base, you know, it evolved into the Rickenbacker Port Authority. Rickenbacker, that name I think you all recognize, born, grew up here in Columbus over on Livingston Avenue. I attended a speech, some of you will remember the old Fort Hayes Hotel over at the corner of Spring and Front. I think it's a Marriott today. I attended a CPA luncheon speech there many years ago, and Eddie Rickenbacker Jr. was the speaker. He said one of his dad's favorite stories, you remember his dad at one time was president of Eastern Airlines. One of his dad's favorite stories was in the early 50s. It was only with the advent of the jet airplane that in one day you could have your breakfast in New York, your lunch in Los Angeles, and your luggage in Buenos Aires. I think that has probably happened to, maybe not to that distance, but to many of us over the years. I mentioned that in the state of Ohio, we have over 1,300 townships. Over 200 of those townships have less than 1,000 population. One of the obstacles to achieving any efficiencies, and I'm well aware you won't find the word efficiency in any of our constitutions or our city charter, but at the same time, there's nothing there that would prohibit us from attempting to achieve as much efficiency as we can. We have so many overlapping jurisdictions. When you look at the townships in Franklin County alone, about 17 of them, over half their population also resides in an incorporated entity, a city or a village. So you have these overlapping jurisdictions. And with 23 fire departments and 36 police departments, believe me, we've got to have some opportunities for more efficiency. I think these quests for efficiency, in past history, many of them have started with, we might say, blue ribbon committees of our citizens. You go back in our research back into the 40s, it was a blue ribbon committee that met and organized the present system of hospitals that we know and love here in Columbus today and throughout Franklin County. It was another similar committee that after the war in the late 40s devised a process of providing some infrastructure throughout the city and throughout the county. Later on in the 50s, and I look at these as some of the, maybe the two most important policy decisions that I can remember in local government here in Franklin County. This was both before my time. But in 1954, you're well aware of the I call it the annexation policy, that essentially said to outlying districts, if you would like to use our water and sewer facilities, sign here. You then became part of Columbus. These facilities are so capital intensive, not very many entities can afford to build water treatment plants and sewage treatment plants. So that's when the annexation burst in the city of Columbus, Ohio. Well, it was a blue ribbon committee of citizens that recommended the second most important policy, I believe, in this area, is what we call that income tax set-aside. That committee said, let's ask for an income tax increase, but let's pledge that we'll take 25% of that income tax and set it aside. We commonly refer to it as the set-aside. We'll use that for infrastructure, streets, roads. Anytime you see a new fire engine going down the street, anytime you see a new building being built, anytime you see a street being paved, that's 25% of that income tax that you're paying. In my view, last year and this year, I don't jump very high on the note of income tax growth, but we are going in the right direction. If this city could get through the years of 2008 and 2009, which was the longest and the most severe recession in my career, and I think for many years before my career. I am so proud of this city and its constituents who repeatedly have recognized the needs and the costs that we face in delivering what I think are high-class services. I've had the privilege of working alongside of many mayors and many city council members, several city attorneys, and I'm very, very proud of the political makeup of the city of Columbus over all these years. I admit, certainly I'm a bit biased about that, but I think I have good reason to be biased. Many times I've been asked, what's the most important thing in government? And I think some of my colleagues, I've heard some of them say, and I think there's good reason, but some of them will say, if we only had more money, we could do this, or if we had more money, we could do that. In my view, that is not the most important factor in good government. Good government, to me, must be an open, diverse, and continuing in dialogue with its citizenry. That's the most important factor, I think, in making Columbus the community that it is. We have every faith recognized here in Columbus. We have every color. We have every gender. We have every mix and choices of gender solicitation and love. That's what makes a community. And that's one of the reasons that I am so proud to be a part of this city for the number of years that I've been here. Thank you.
I think the first thing that sticks out to me is 46 years is a very long time. What is the secret to your longevity? What's the secret to not only continuing to win your re-elections, but for you to have the excitement to come back to office every year?
Well, I remember when I first went into City Hall, I told my wife I was only going for a couple of years so I'd get a little government experience. But she tells me that's the first of the political promises that were broken during that time. The job is ever changing and ever learning. I've said, when the day I stop learning, that's when you can carry me out. But this society, this local government, this city, this community of Columbus, I'm always thinking in terms of community. It is so wonderful here. We've all done a lot of traveling to different cities and so forth. I wouldn't trade our community for any that I've been to.
And you've seen a lot of changes over the years since you took office. What are some of the biggest projects, I'm thinking development-wise, that you've seen that you're most proud of?
Well, I think there are several developments that we're all very, very familiar with and that have begun in the last 20, 25 years in particular. And a couple of them, again, under the administration of Greg Lashutka had their beginnings. We know Easton, we know Polaris, we know the whole Arena District. The revitalization of the Short North, I think, can be, and of course, many, many years before that, it was the revitalization of German Village. But this more recent revitalization of Short North, I think, can be held up to the country as a model to copy.
And the projects that you just mentioned have all been fairly successful. What's the secret to that success? What's Columbus doing right that maybe other cities aren't quite getting?
Well, certainly can't speak for all cities, but I've always felt that Columbus has been open to ideas, open to changes. And any meeting that I've been in over the years when we talk about development or bricks and mortar, there's always been I think, a common thought, let's put quality first. I'm sure there are some developments in Columbus that we probably spent more money on that maybe some of our peer cities would. But I'm a firm believer in quality, and I think that's one of the factors that makes us successful.
After a couple of decades in office, I'm sure there's some projects that maybe you weren't totally on board with. Are there any projects that stick out that maybe you were saying, I'd rather not do that, but the city went with it anyway?
God, Greg, should I bring up that power plant? Well, that was one.
Okay.
I think now you'll see more and more, and it's already beginning, the city is giving more focus to the neighborhoods, the south side, the Near East, the whole redevelopment and rehabilitation of the Lincoln Theater, a beautiful, beautiful venue for all of us. There's more attention now in its early stages being given to Franklinton. I have a very, very close bias to Franklinton because that's where I grew up. Greg used to say I grew up with Lucas Sullivan. That's not quite true. But I did grow up in his neighborhood. So I think those are the areas you'll see greater focus on now.
Are there any areas that you think are maybe flying under the radar that might be a little underserved now that you think the city might pay more attention to in the future?
Well, these areas that I've mentioned in particular, I think rightfully will get more attention in the future, and that has already begun. Mayor Coleman has already led a lot of renovation throughout those areas. But I think the south side, Near East side, and Franklinton are the areas that we'll focus on.
You've referenced Mayor Lashutka a couple of times. By my count, it seems like you served under 5 different mayors during your time in service. What's the dynamic between your office and the mayor's office?
Well, I think it's fair for me to say that I've worked well with every mayor. We have to be a pragmatist. Any of you who are bookkeepers, you know you have to be a pragmatist. And that's always been my style, is to be forthright, put it out there, and when judgments are made, sometimes they're made you're in agreement with, sometimes you're not in agreement with. But if you do it in an open light, you have to walk away with some satisfaction.
Is that another key to your longevity, to be able to adjust to each administration?
I'd like to think so, yeah.
Do you have a favorite mayor?
I have several favorite mayors.
Do you have 5? You have 5 favorite mayors? Yeah. How important is it for the city of Columbus to have that AAA bond rating from all the agencies?
Well, from a financial standpoint, it's very important. It saves us money. You gain lower interest rates in the market. This good city of Columbus, we have almost precisely $4 billion of outstanding bonds and notes. 2/3 of that debt is for sewer and water facilities. We do not borrow money for operations. We don't pay our bills with borrowed money. It's all capital type money. So when you think in those sizes, those amounts, every basis point or two, every bit of a lowered interest rate, it means one of two things. Either you save money at the time, or you have some money that you can do additional projects with. So I think it's very, very important. I mentioned that our AAA bond rating began in 1995 with Standard & Poor's and Moody's. We added Fitch in 2006. The other, among the top 25 in population, the other cities are San Antonio is the largest. Austin, Texas, in the last census, Austin was like 3,000 or 4,000 people more than the city of Columbus. So they have a AAA. Columbus is the third largest. Charlotte, North Carolina is fourth, and Boston is fifth. Everyone thinks Boston is so big and so big and so big, but when you think of cities and managing cities, Columbus is the 15th largest in the city and larger than Boston. You won't be surprised to know of those 25. The two very, very, very lowest rated cities are Detroit and Chicago.
You talked about the city system of taking 25% and always putting it towards capital or towards infrastructure. Is that something that needed to start very early on, started a long time ago? Can big cities all of a sudden change course and say, all right, we're going to do something the way Columbus does it?
Well, if they were smart, they would. But that set aside, as we call it, let me make a statement here, and my guess is many of you will be surprised. But if you just think of cities, forget for the moment about school districts, counties, various levies, and so forth. The city of Columbus has not had a property tax rate increase in over 50 years. Well, how in the world can you operate without that? It's because of that income tax. Columbus was the third city in the nation to have a municipal income tax. Philadelphia was first in 1939. Toledo, Ohio, by the way, was next, 1947. Columbus, we started collecting, not me, in 1948. And I'll just say, I think the city in 1948 collected about $2 million of income tax, and this year we'll be getting close to, maybe not quite, about $800 million. So if anyone tells you that government continues to grow, believe them.
There is an article in the Columbus Dispatch in 2007 where you were talking about Mayor Jack Sensenbrenner, and you said, through his policy decisions and his vision, Sensenbrenner put a greater stamp on Central Ohio more than any other human being. What did you mean by that? What did you see back then that you're now seeing the impact of?
Well, my references, again, were to those, what I consider maybe the two most important policy decisions. The annexation policy and the, Columbus is like 228 square miles. We're almost three times the size of Cleveland, almost 3 times the size of Cincinnati. So that annexation policy and then the follow-up of the income tax set-aside.
Right now, there's all sorts of news stories going on with City Hall at the focus. City Council President Andrew Ginther is caught in the middle of a corruption investigation. There are stories going on with Mayor Michael Coleman as well. How do those stories impact your office, and does that have anything, how is that impacting your work at all?
Not at all, not at all. I haven't been questioned on them, but I don't hesitate to make it clear. I try not to avoid questions, how difficult they may be sometimes. I supported both Andy Ginther and Michael Coleman before these stories began, and I still support both of them.
How has 46 years, technology has changed dramatically. How has that impacted the way that you do things in your office?
Well, I don't think Hugh Dorrian has evolved as quickly as the technology has. The secret to making it work is to have great, wonderful people around you. Over the years, I've been able to build a staff that I would stack up against anybody, private industry or government. Wonderful, wonderful group of people. They spoil me. So that's how I address the ever-evolving technology world.
You mentioned a well-qualified staff, and I've been able to talk to some of your quote-unquote proteges. What are some of the things that you teach your staffers, and what are some wisdoms that you impart along the way?
Well, I like to share some of the things I learned from my father, other things that I learned at the university. And before coming to city employment, I was a CPA for several years before coming to the city with a national CPA firm. And I believe in quality work. Maybe some of the staff would say I nag them from time to time, but I believe in quality work. And I think that represents the community when you put out a product. Accuracy to the extent possible. We make our mistakes, but I believe in quality work, and I think that's what I try to impart.
A couple years ago, the city approved a tax increase. Do you think it gained approval because of that quality? Do they trust the city?
Well, you know, that was in 2009 when we went for the tax increase from 2 to 2.5%. Most elected officials that I can think of favored it. I certainly supported it along with the mayor. When citizens vote in favor of something, whether it's a tax or a policy issue of some kind, it's an expression of trust. No tax increase in my memory, and I don't think there ever will be one, that wins in a landslide. That was a narrow vote, but all tax increases are narrow votes. So I took it as an expression of trust in the city.
You seem to have a healthy respect for the voters, a healthy respect for the people you serve. Do you think more of that, do you think that more city officials, more public officials need that respect for the constituents?
Well, I think most of them that I have known do have that respect. And I'm a big believer in the electoral process. I'm not a supporter of term limits in terms, how could I support term limits? Especially in the sense of the legislative branch in particular. But I think everybody's cognizant of the power of the voter, and that's where the power should reside.
What's the relationship between the city and the state? A couple of years ago, the state has been cutting the local government fund. I'm sure that impacted Columbus. What's that relationship like?
Well, you know, many times I've said myself and others have said cities are children of the state. For the last few years, we felt more like stepchildren, I'm sure. No question about it, the cuts in revenues to cities, villages, counties, and so forth have been pretty dramatic. And it has forced all of us to adopt. And it's easy to say if we had more money, we could do more services, which is true. But we do live with balanced budgets in the state of Ohio. I think you all know that's the law. And so it forces us to adopt in certain areas.
Does that get back to the whole shared services idea that you were talking about?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
What's a big hurdle? You're mentioning how the state of Ohio has a ton of local governments. What's the big hurdle in the effort to scale down on that?
Well, it's interesting. In my observation, when you think about Unigov or any form of it, the opposition always comes from the suburbs. I think most core cities are more agreeable to that thought than the suburbs are. Local governments are very, very parochial, and they're very, very defensive about their identity. So I don't think you're going to see these numbers of entities disappear, and that's why I think we've got to focus our efforts more toward unifying services, and let's forget about changing somebody's boundary line from time to time.
could that result in a loss of jobs, and is that just a negative impact that has to happen in order to help scale down?
If there's any loss of jobs, it would be in the administrative areas of some of these local governments, but I'm not so sure that's all bad.
Was it hard to convince people to say, listen, we need to do this, even if it means making the tough choices?
I would say up to this point, it's been impossible.
In a few minutes, we'll move to the audience questions, but I'll ask you one more, and you kind of touched on this. Last year, you sent the mayor a letter with some budget concerns saying that maybe the city might be spending a little more money than it's taking in. How did all that end up, and where's the city now? Are we in a good place now?
Well, you can't be a whole lot better when you get 3 AAA bond ratings, and they were confirmed as recently as last Wednesday. The city of Columbus ended calendar year, cities in Ohio were all on calendar years, 2014, as having its second largest reserve in the history of the city. I say second because the year before was the largest, and out of an approximate $800 million budget, we did in fact spend about $3 million more than the year before.
So we're in a good place?
In a very good place.
Yeah.
Very good place. That's part of my role. Part of my job is Isaiah, letters that I send out, they're not letters of condemnation, they're letters of warning and getting your attention. Usually works.
Do you ever have to be the bad guy? Is that something that comes along with the job?
Yes.
Is it hard to say no, or do you have strength behind that because of conviction?
One of the very, very early lessons I learned many years ago was how to say no. So it's not difficult. No, sometimes it is, but
Who are some of the people that have impacted your life throughout the years with your service?
Well, I always start with my father. My father was a small independent grocer. I grew up in his grocery store and learned from him. I'll tell you anecdotally, both of my parents were immigrants. I'm the first generation, a full generation in this country. My mother came through Ellis Island in 1920, and like all immigrants, they had to have a job waiting for them or a connection. So my mother made it to Pittsburgh, and she was a maid to the Andrew Mellon family. So I always think if I have any financial acumen at all, I learned it in the womb. You know, I think someone asked me to count the numbers of city council members that I've worked alongside of, and I think I came up to 44, and maybe I missed a few. But there's been a lot of good public servants in this community, a lot of good public servants. And you try to learn something from all of them. So I think I have.
Okay. You think you're ready for audience questions now?
Yeah, sure.
All right. Well, it's CMC's tradition to take audience questions. Please step to the microphone and give us your name and ask your question. And thank you in advance for not making long editorial comments. Mayor Lashutka is moving towards the mic, just to warn you.
So I come not to criticize Caesar, but to praise him. Hugh, without question, you're my favorite auditor. On a serious note, what many of you in this room and in the audience that's listening later on, Hugh has been the most bipartisan confidant one could have as a city official. When you go down to talk to him, brainstorm ideas, first and foremost, the city of Columbus and its people were the most important. And he's added that advice not just to me, but to council members and other mayors I know, and it has been invaluable. He's been a man of great principle. He has challenged us to do the right things financially. When you think about cities that got in trouble, it's when they shortcut those valuable characteristics of what Hugh Dorrian represents, and so I say thank you.
My name is John Rosenberger, and I just follow the 2 toughest acts in town. Hugh, I hope you'll forgive me for a couple humorous recollections. The first one, to be meaningful, assumes you know something about Mayor Reinhardt's short-lived downtown auto race. And soon after that, there was a little party, and there was a skit involved. It was loosely fashioned on Karnak the Magnificent. You remember this, right? And so it came time, and the answer is the Columbus 500. What do we call the people who voted against Hugh Dorrian in the last municipal election? I've had the pleasure of working a great deal with Mr. Dorrian for a very long time. And a couple, 3 years ago, was when he was inducted into the Columbus Hall of Fame, no small matter. I had the honor of making the remarks on that occasion. So I want you to understand that we have been somewhat close. Soon after that, we were in his office and we'd finished a little something. And I said, Hugh, how long have we been working together? And so we did the math, and it was 30 years. And it was sort of a little nostalgia about all that. And we decided we'd have lunch together. And so we did travel to lunch together to that culinary mecca on West Broad Street, Phillips, Coney Island. And we had a nice lunch, and they brought the 2 checks. Now it's time, obviously, to reach for the checks. And again, to remind you, we've worked together for over 30 years. I've made these remarks at the induction ceremony, and so I reached for the checks, and he said, John, separate checks. His check was $7.
Hi, Andy Campbell. I'm going to ask you an actual question. So I'm aware that the state of Ohio is, in regards to public funding of transportation, ranks really at the bottom of our nation. And I'm wondering your thoughts in regards to the responsibility of the city, perhaps, to do a little better and maybe do better in funding public transportation for the citizens and for the city as a whole. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I've thought a lot about it over the years, and it's clearly a monetary challenge. But when I look into the future, and for that matter, look at the current conditions, you know, I mentioned we're 228 square miles, very, very flat city. Columbus and Central Ohio definitely needs an improved transportation system, whether it's light rail or some form of mass transit. I'm not the engineering expert, but we have to address that problem. I talk about Easton and Polaris, how many jobs. They're wonderful, wonderful job centers, both of them. But getting people in the inner city to those areas to work is a challenge. So collectively, we have to address the mass transit situation in Central Ohio. Don't have the answer yet.
Hello, Mr. Dorrian. I'm an architect, and my question is regarding income taxes, and especially those levied during the recession, the additional 0.5% that was levied in 2009, I believe it was. How do you feel about rolling those back as the economy has improved? Just how do you feel about that? Is it something you ever seen done in other places, et cetera?
I don't know that I've seen it done, but I will tell you it's not going to happen. If everyone's willing to roll back the services, there'd be a possibility, but that's not going to happen. There's not going to be a rollback of taxes.
Mr. Dorrian, I'm Jane Scott, and I assure you that we have not run out of speakers, but I think we've had one of our best today. Question for you. All of us have moments in our lives, and certainly in your career, where it's kind of something happens and you stop and you realize where you are and what's happening, and there's a snapshot that stays in your life and in your mind, and it's kind of a defining moment. Tell us some of the defining moments where you stopped and took that picture and said, I'm in the right place at the right time. I'll never forget this.
Well, outside of my wonderful family, 4 grown children, 10 grandchildren, and my wife, those are certainly the most memorable of all people and associated events. God, I try many, many, many times to forget this, but I actually ran for mayor in 1975 and got my ears pinned back pretty well. So at that time, I think I came to realize that God wants me to be city auditor. So that was one defining moment at the time.
Well, I was going to ask you if you ever had thoughts of running for other public office, but I guess after 75, were you done with? Did you ever have thoughts of maybe running for state legislature or any other office?
No.
What's the most fulfilling thing about what you do? Of course,
Continuing challenge and trying to serve the community. That I just recognize this role as one of great trust. And I take that very seriously. The challenges continue. They change every day. And that's what keeps me there, along with a lot of votes. Thank you all very much.
And that sort of goes against the norm a little bit, doesn't it? Because with other politicians, with other public servants, they're always kind of looking to go higher and higher.
Well, some do, but I continue to believe this community of ours, we've had many, many, many wonderful public servants. I'm high on the community, and that's one of the reasons. There are those who choose to seek other offices, but I trust they're using their good judgment in doing so.
Well, everyone, I hope you enjoyed today's forum. Please. That was excellent. We encourage you to continue the conversation outside in the lobby for cookies and coffee. Remember that you can view and share all the forums of the CMC on CTV Columbus Television, on WOSU and PBS affiliates statewide through the Ohio channel, and anytime on CMC's website through YouTube. Before we conclude, please help me thank our sponsors. Once again, Columbus Monthly Magazine and Taft Law. And of course, thank our speakers today, Mr. Hugh Dorrian and Andy Chow. Thank you. Thanks to all you for being here, and we look to see you at the next CMC Forum. Thanks a lot.